Sarah Miller, one of America's leading trustbusters. Sarah, what is a trustbuster?
I think traditionally when we think of trustbusters, we tend to think back to the first Gilded Age and the reaction to that under Woodrow Wilson and then later FDR. There was a real movement within government and among the population to take on concentrations of power. So Standard Oil, for example, the railroads, right? There was a very rich period in our history when, just like today, inequality was skyrocketing. The political power of a very small group of CEOs and financiers was immense. And that really ushered in decades of aggressive action against these concentrations of corporate power throughout the government. So that included antitrust cases and investigations and a whole range of policies that attempted to check and suppress excessive concentrations of corporate power so that inequality could go down, which it did, economic opportunity could increase, and democracy could be more vibrant.
What happened in the period between the first trustbusters and this latest generation of trustbusting?
Essentially in the 1970s, the kind of legacy of the New Deal had petered out. A new generation of leadership had come into Washington that did not have kind of at the center this antagonistic, skeptical approach towards concentrated corporate power, concentrated economic power. During that time, there was a robust movement led by a number of academics, in particular Robert Bork, who everyone knows for other reasons, to overturn the way that we were, as a society, kind of executing the antitrust laws, and to say, no, these laws have been really holding back our economy. They've been suppressing and punishing success, and we need to basically, take our hands off, let businesses grow bigger and bigger, because that'll bring more efficiencies to consumers. It was a whole shift of how we think about corporate power.
And 19th century antitrust law was built around the protection of the consumer. Is that correct?
No, that's not right at all. That's sort of an artificial definition that was laced through antitrust doctrine in the 1970s. Really, the notion of consumer didn't exist at that time in any meaningful way. Antitrust law, in large part, was constructed to protect smaller producers that could be bullied and cheated. It was designed to protect workers and consumers in the context of large dominant corporations being able to extract wealth or exert market power in ways that essentially allowed them to steal from these other groups, to disallow that. It was intended to make sure that entrepreneurs could succeed on the merits of their idea and weren't disadvantaged by excessive market power. And it was also put in place to protect democracy. It was a very clear kind of philosophy that any sort of concentration of economic power was a threat to our very democracy, right? Louis Brandeis said, we can have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, or we can have democracy, but we can't have both.
In the 19th century, it wasn't illegal to be a monopoly. Is that correct? It's the way in which you leverage your economic power. No one's ever talked about making monopolies illegal.
Well, it's how you address it, right? So you can have natural monopolies, right? Electricity, for example, that is a monopoly where it maybe doesn't make sense to have competition in the traditional way that we think about it. So in that sense, you have additional regulatory regimes that overlay those systems. So it's not that monopoly per se is always illegal, but there are criminal penalties for attempting to monopolize a market, for exerting and abusing market power in certain ways. So this is not a sort of set of kind of ethics that we expect businesses to follow. There is serious criminal and civil law involved in some of these behaviors.
How important do you think antitrust regulation was in the relative success of American democracy for much of the 20th century?
Well, I think it's kind of a long process and experiment. And what you saw in the 1920s, right, in particular, was the rise of essentially a small kind of plutocracy, right, from the 1890s to the 1920s. And they began, they had an enormous control, not only over whole sections of the economy. They were very interrelated with Wall Street at the time. And then they were very interrelated with government. You had Andrew Mellon, who was essentially the Jeff Bezos of the day, sitting atop of the Treasury Department for 12 years. So you can kind of imagine in today's context what it would be like if we had Jeff Bezos running the Treasury Department. We are again kind of at a moment in time where we need to be asking these questions, these fundamental questions about power in our democracy, who has it, and how do you make sure that it's distributed in ways that both protect and expand what we like to think of as economic liberties, as well as protect and expand a democracy that is a continuing work in progress. And I think, just to be clear, one of the misconceptions about this work is that it's all about antitrust. Antitrust is one tool that you can use to limit and protect democracy, protect workers, protect smaller businesses from excessive concentrations of power. There's a whole range of policies that you want to kind of infuse the governing process with if you want to protect a range of other constituencies from concentrated economic power. That's tax law, that's anti-corruption law, that's different regulatory regimes. Antitrust is one tool, and it's not at all the only one. It's really an orientation about how you want to engage in policymaking in ways that affect market structure.
Do you think there's something incompatible between a class of Mellons or our Carnegies, contemporary terms, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, today's multi-billionaires and democracy, or can they coexist?
I do not think that we can have a strong, inclusive democracy when there are a handful of people, a handful of corporations that control so much of the American economy and then have essentially almost unlimited ways to influence our political system, from funding research to influencing public opinion through public relations campaigns, through running for office in kind of infinitely financed campaigns.
Bezos might say, well, I'm worth $150 billion because I took advantage of a remarkable opportunity. I worked incredibly hard. I came from nothing. And I'm actually behaving responsibly with my wealth. I've just committed $10 billion to saving the planet. I've invested in the Washington Post, which is probably, along with the New York Times, the most respected newspaper. I'm trying to innovate on how I treat my workers. What's wrong with a society which rewards smart, lucky people?
You have to acknowledge that our markets are shaped and built by law. And for the last 40 years, we have had basically almost a lawless economy in many ways.
Anarchy then, chaos.
There are laws on the books that haven't been enforced. There are regulations that have not been really respected or enforced either. So you basically have had some very smart individuals who have navigated loopholes in the law that have been able to exploit this kind of lawless environment and then, build towards this extraordinary amount of market power.
What are these loopholes in the law that allowed Amazon to grow so fast? After all, they raised money through venture capital. They built an enormous customer base, most of whom love Amazon, who think they get great deals. They're incredibly reliable. They've invested in many other businesses. What in a different regulatory regime, how would Amazon have been stymied?
The current way that we kind of look at antitrust in particular, you have a focus on low prices, right? But when you look at Amazon today, you have a corporation that has amassed this enormous amount of market power and then uses that essentially to push down everyone else that it competes with, number one. So a lot of the third-party groups that sell on its platform, they engage in a range of tactics to put them out of business.
Is that illegal? Or it should be illegal, or it is illegal?
It is, in some cases, it is absolutely illegal, the tactics that they use, but they are just not enforced in that way. The law is on its head right now, and we need to right-size it. They then use kind of their market power in one space to leapfrog it into another. For example, you have Amazon buying a company like Whole Foods, right? Which on the one hand, oh, okay, maybe that's all right. But then what they're doing is they're looking to amass huge amounts of data to then take over kind of sector after sector of the economy and using these adjacent markets to kind of leverage additional power as they really expand their reach. So these are things that our regulators are empowered to block, to say no to. It's really a judgment about what is the right way to structure markets. And it is fundamentally a political question. For the last 40 years, we've been saying like, no rules, hands off, do whatever you want.
Have we actually been formally saying that, or is that the consequence of our lack of action?
For the most part, we have been formally saying exactly the talking points that you put in Jeff Bezos's mouth a few minutes ago, that this is all about punishing success, that markets know how to function efficiently, that really there might be some negative externalities, but in the long run, it's not the government's role to think about these sorts of questions.
Let's say that these monopolists had been stymied one way or the other, Amazon, Google, some of the big biotech and transportation companies. How would that have changed today's American democracy? Would we have had the same crisis of legitimacy? Would we have had this shift to extreme?
I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I just want to lay out a few statistics to kind of ground this conversation, right? So over the last 20 years, 75% of industries have become more concentrated. We have had purchasing power of your average American family decline by $5,000 a year. It's a lot of money. We have had median annual compensation today it's $33,000. If we still had a competitive economy, it would be $43,000. It's $10,000 gap. We have new business formation at a 40-year low, and we really have seen kind of inequality continue to go through the roof. So I think you have to connect these questions of kind of extreme inequality, of a lot of economic fragility, and the gyrations that are happening in our economy right now. I don't think there's one silver bullet. I think there's a range of reasons. But I think when you have a political system that allows a small number of extremely wealthy individuals and corporations to set the narrative using a range of different tools, then you really are kind of walking into a serious crisis of democracy.
There'll be some people watching this conversation, Sarah, who will sniff the S word in what you're saying, socialism. That what she's really saying is capitalism doesn't work and we need to control it. Is there an element, maybe not on behalf of what you're saying, but on this new trust, this climate of trust busting, is the subtext socialism? Is the subtext a hostility to the free market and capitalism?
I think when you talk about democratic socialism, the way I tend to define that and think about it in general is a much more robust set of public investments in healthcare, public investments in education. And I think that when you think about the work that we do, it is in general complementary to that, right? We want to decentralize economic power. We have a system, an economic system, that is rooted in commerce and markets. And I don't think that democratic socialism intends to change that in fundamental ways. What we need to do is think about and learn about how these markets are structured, because right now the rules are set in such a way where power and wealth are transferred up and up and up. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case at all.
How does trust busting, and 21st century trust busting in particular, fit in with our new globalized economy? How can we bust these multinational corporations? We know, Google and Amazon and Apple, these are American corporations, but much of their operations and their wealth lies overseas.
In general, this is a global problem. And we've actually seen regulators in Europe and in other places around the world, even in India, where they kind of broke up Amazon in one particular way. They said you can't compete on the same platform, which is something that we think is really important. Kind of take root and start to take on these corporations in different types of markets. So there is not a one-size solution to any of these problems, and we're seeing kind of competition actually in different parts of the world, especially on the tech front.
Sorry, are you calling for either current international organizations or new international organizations to address the problems of concentration of power in global capitalism in the early part of the 21st century?
Yeah, I think in general, existing regulators really need to step up and look at questions of power fundamentally, right? This isn't necessarily about a tax here or a tweak there, but we need to change. Our democratic institutions in the US and around the world need to change the way that they're interacting vis-a-vis these incredibly powerful institutions. And that is happening in Europe already in terms of the tech platforms, Google, Facebook in particular. And we're having an increasingly robust debate on the left and also on the right about how to do that here. So I think it's important to continue to educate the public, to talk about the roots of a lot of the problems that these corporations are having so we can develop the political will and the kind of public education to deal with them over time.
So you wouldn't agree with either Presidents Obama or Trump, who both said they don't agree about very much, but they both seem to agree that European attempts to control or regulate large American tech companies is really just sour grapes on the part of Europeans who aren't able to build their own Googles or Facebook.
Right. I disagree kind of strongly with that. And I think as we've seen the negative effects, in particular of Google and Facebook, have on democracy, I think that is not really a very tenable position to have anymore.
Consumers have a responsibility here, Sarah, also, because let's face it, okay, Google's a monopoly, we all know that. But there are many other search engines. There's Microsoft's Bing, there's DuckDuckGo that guarantees privacy. There are many other ways to buy products online or offline, but we choose to use Amazon. There are many other social networks, but we choose to use Facebook. At what point does the consumer become responsible for their own behavior?
Yeah, I think that's really a myth. Facebook, Google, and Amazon are essentially almost impossible to avoid. If you use the internet, Facebook tracks you over millions and millions of websites, whether or not you're on Facebook or not. They are incredibly sophisticated in accessing the data of consumers and users of the internet, period, regardless of whether you're checking on Facebook to see if there's any cat videos or what your cousin did, these are incredibly sophisticated companies that are now essentially, in many ways, the internet.
Google is also the internet, Amazon is the internet, Apple is the internet. So these aren't monopolies.
But it's really about kind of unified control over a market. And that doesn't mean there's only one corporation in that market. There can be a small handful, right? There are a number of ways that having just a small number of corporations in a market can affect outcomes in really negative ways. Things like, basically equilibrium collusion, where competition isn't going to be robust if there's just a handful of corporations.
Are you saying that Facebook, these big players collude?
I think that we absolutely see sort of implicit collusion in a lot of these markets, and a lot of it is essentially legal, right? The way that Apple tries to work with other platforms to make sure that its products are prioritized, things like that. So it's just all been, because of lack of enforcement, it's almost out in the open, these problems and these practices.
Who should be enforcing it? Is it these Washington, D.C. based FCC style organizations, or does it come at a higher political level? Is it Congress? Is it the Supreme Court? Is it the president?
One of the exciting things about this area is that you can do a lot of different things to address these problems. So the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, has authority over enforcing antitrust laws. The Department of Justice does as well. They kind of divide up their portfolios, right? You also have Congress. You can legislate solutions to these problems. For example, there's legislation in Congress right now called Do Not Track. It's bipartisan legislation. And that would essentially allow you as a consumer to say, I don't want to be targeted by advertising for Facebook and Google unless I give you permission. And that would force a change, most likely, in those two corporations' business model in really powerful ways.
Do we need to take money out of politics too? After all, these corporations are spending more money on supporters in DC than anyone else.
Yeah, I think that would be nice, right? When you kind of go around and talk to the man, the woman on the street about this, you see a lot of genuine outrage on the left and the right about lobbying and the influence of lobbyists in Washington, D.C. So I don't think that you can necessarily, like I said, say, oh, here's the one solution and it will solve everything. Like, absolutely not. This is just a piece that has been ignored, both on the left and the right, or actively dismantled, essentially, for 40 years, and we have to start fixing that. But there's no way that, the status quo of kind of money in politics should be allowed to stand. It's become, equally egregious and out of control and damaging.
Finally, Sarah, let's say some of these methods, some of these strategies are successful. You have changes in campaign finance laws. You have changes from the FCC and Congress and local, state and national government, federal government. If all this starts happening, how will American politics, how will American democracy change?
The foundation of our economy is in many ways very broken, has allowed to become very broken. So you have markets that it's how our economy works for the most part, and they've all been designed to push wealth and push power to the very top. And so what we want is to restructure markets. It's one part of the work that we do, so that that's not the case anymore. We want to make sure that power and wealth are decentralized and start to reverse these dramatic levels of inequality that we've seen kind of rise up over the last 30 or 40 years in tandem with this trend, right? And like I said, this is one piece of how we can build a more just economic system. It is not the only piece, but it's one that I think is essential if we want to preserve the democracy that we have left at this point.
So what should people do? Give money to organizations like yours?
Sure, we'll take it. We're very tiny. We like to joke that
What's the name of your organization?
The American Economic Liberties Project. We like to joke that our budget is about the same as Facebook spends on kale chips every month. But I think in general, yes, we need to push against this enormous power of corporate America and monopolies. I mean, to understand it and call it out and share stories. Like, we hear almost on a daily basis from small business people who have been abused by Amazon. We work with unions and working people who are going against these incredibly, incredibly powerful corporations, more powerful than any, kind of that we've ever encountered, certainly in our lifetimes. We need to continue this conversation about power, right? That's kind of what's at the center of a lot of the problems that we have today.